Hey Mohammed, how you doing?
Hey Zach, I'm good.
So today we're going to go through some JupyterLab notebooks, and we're going to try to transfer this code into JupyterLab so that we can visualize the code. So can you tell us a little bit about JupyterLab?
Sure. So JupyterLab is something, it came after Jupyter Notebook. And the idea behind JupyterLab is to have an IDE, but still maintain that Jupyter Notebook experience, meaning to say, have a web-based way of developing code. So we'll see that we'll see what features JupyterLab brings that makes this possible. But before that, what we will do is we need to install it, and we will install JupyterLab inside the Docker container, and then we will launch it from inside the Docker container, and then we will see how we can use our web browser to navigate to open JupyterLab that is residing inside that Docker container. So in our last session, we did create a Dockerfile, right? So can you open it, please? So it's very bare bones now. But now what we'll do is we'll add some instructions to install JupyterLab. So first things first, we need to figure out how the hell do we install JupyterLab? So for that, Google.
So while I'm Googling this, let me ask you a question. So I've
Sure.
used your notebooks a bit in the past, and one of the nice things is you're able to have a little bit of structure where you're visualizing the code or you're visualizing, say, graphs or the output of statistical models in a nice, clean way underneath the code. And it
Mhm.
creates almost like a story from beginning of end to analysis. Um, I'm assuming JupyterLab offers you all of that, but what are some other advantages of using JupyterLab as opposed to, say, just using a Python file in VS Code?
So if you were to use a Python file, you will have difficulty visualizing your plots because you can't visualize it in line in the text file. Chances are, if you were to do it in VS Code, it will open up a window, right? And then that's where your plot will reside, which is kind of jarring because you are writing your code on one window and then suddenly another window pops up, right?
Yep.
That's one thing. But to me, the main benefit of notebooks is that it's a good presentation tool. You can mix normal text, to write your narrative about what you're trying to do. You can also use LaTeX to write the math equations that you're trying to implement. And then you can also visualize your results inline, right? The disadvantage of notebooks for me is that, and this can be controversial to some people, uh, but for me, it's lacking a way for you to apply software engineering best practices out of the box. For example, you can't write unit with vanilla Jupyter Notebook. It's very hard for you to write unit tests. That being said, there are some people who have gone through the trouble to write extensions to allow you to write unit tests in a Jupyter Notebook environment. But it's still not very straightforward. There are issues, installation,
Mhm.
especially, when you upgrade your Jupyter Notebook library in the future, then there might be some breakages for a while, and then yeah, you're left, trying to just forget about it or figure out the bug yourself. So yeah, um, so yeah,
Well,
to summarize, notebooks are great for presentation and also for exploratory kind of code. But once you want to write production quality code, you ought to drop back to Python scripts.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was going to say, much like Much like a good statistician, you just don't worry about unit tests and you're perfect.
Oh, that's a good one.
So when
So
we search
yeah, you
for
should be,
JupyterLab installation, I'm guessing.
yep, something like that. Yeah, so it's the first one. Okay, so fortunately, JupyterLab is one of those libraries where to use it, it's only a matter of running a single command. And in this case, it's either, you can use either conda or pip. And yeah, it's just that one command. So so now we know how to install JupyterLab, and let's stick with the pip approach. So it's just, so if we were on our if we wanted to install JupyterLab locally, we will just open the terminal and then type pip install JupyterLab, right? But we want to do this in the Dockerfile and have it installed in the container. So the question is, how do we execute command line terminals? Sorry, how do we execute command line instructions inside a Docker container? The answer is, in Dockerfile, there is a command called run. And when I say command, it's like a reserve keyword, just like, when you wanted to specify an image, you say from. So yeah, run is also another keyword that tells Docker that I want you to run the following thing in a terminal when you build this container. So
That's how it'll go.
yeah,
I'm guessing all the keywords are capitalized, and then I can run
not
install.
for the capitalization, I'm not sure, but yeah, I always capitalize it because most of the time I copy paste stuff from the internet. It's always capitalized. Right. Okay, so that's all there is to it, to install JupyterLab in a Docker container. Now, since we've modified Dockerfile, we need to save it and then rebuild the container.
Can I ask
So
a
sure.
So when we are running our Docker file, when we create the new container, I'm guessing that it's going to run this code one time and save the result somewhere so that every time we run our application, it's not downloading JupyterLab. Is that right?
That's right. So when you build a container the first time, yes, it will download stuff from the internet. And then, yeah, that's whatever the Docker file says. But then when you shut down the container, and then later on, like let's say, tomorrow you wanted to do your work again, and then you have to instantiate the same container, right? This time, if there is no changes to your Docker file, then everything will be pulled from cache, and then the build time will be instantaneous. Oh, and also, in fact, right, if you were to do it in the command line, to run a container, it's a two-stage process. You need to run Docker build that will build the container, and then Docker run that will actually instantiate. So what build does is that it creates like a, yeah, you can say like a dormant version of the container and puts it in your local hard drive and use it as a cache, so that when you say Docker run the image, it will know that I just have to look at your local cache to instantiate your container.
Okay, terrific.
Yeah. So that is if you were to use the command line, to build and run your containers, but we're using VS Code. So how does it work with VS Code? Well, with VS Code, if you change things pertaining to the Docker infrastructure, so in this case, it's the Dockerfile and also the .devcontainer file, which is a config file specific to VS Code. If there is any change to do, if you make any change to those files, and then later you say you run open folder in container, VS Code will detect there's a change in these files, and then there will be a pop-up asking you, do you want to rebuild your container? Yeah. But in this case, since we know that we changed something, we should rebuild it. And to rebuild the container in VS Code, you need to call up the command palette.
Okay, so I brought up the command palette, and now we're going to search for build.
Although we're going to search rebuild.
Rebuild.
Yeah. So do you see that? Container colon, yep, that one. So execute that, and then we wait a bit.
Okay, so I just executed it.
And then it's done. That is surprisingly fast. Yeah, it really is done. Huh. Interesting.
Well, that was in stark contrast to last week when it took forever. So VS Code knew it owed me one, which is I'm pretty sure how that works.
Okay, well, let's verify that JupyterLab is really inside your container right now. So if you go to the terminal in the container, which is at the bottom there, you'll need to launch JupyterLab. So you could Google it, but I already know the answer to it. So to launch JupyterLab from the command line, it's just Jupyter space lab.
Okay.
Yeah, so it is installed, but yeah, there's some issues with running it. Okay. So yeah, I still can't get over how fast it was. But anyway, okay. Look, let's try to look at this error. Can you maximize the terminal? You can click the that like arrow head pointing up. Okay. So the error is cannot assign requested address. Yeah, so this is not data science related. It's more like a computer networking related kind of thing. So if I recall correctly, the default IP address that Jupyter will use to host the server is 127.0.0, the localhost thing. Now, for some reason that I still couldn't figure out or understand, if you were to do, if you were to host a notebook, the server inside a Docker container, the IP address you need to use is 0000, 4 zeros separated by a dot. Yeah. So what you need to do is rerun JupyterLab, but this time also add the argument /IP and then that IP address.
Okay, so we're going to rerun JupyterLab. And then I'm guessing we will tell it an argument with the dash.
Yep, double dash.
Double dash. And then what will we tell it?
Sorry, Zach. There seems to be like a significant lag between what you're typing and what's appearing on screen,
Okay.
at least from my perspective. So IP,
Okay.
double dash IP. And
And
then the IP address we want, then we need to tell it what IP address we want to use to host the server. And that would be 0000.
I don't need full sign or anything.
No need, space. After the IP, space.
Okay, so we have rerunning the JupyterLab with the new IP address of 0000.
Yeah, but you know, IP address format just is the number followed by a dot, not just all zeros. So can you insert a dot in between those zeros?
Oh, in between each zero?
Yeah. Except for the last and first one. Execute this one. And then let's see.
So it's asking me to also use the argument allow root.
Yeah. So here's the thing with Docker. By default, if any, yeah, by default, if all the commands that are run inside the container is being run as root, and usually, we will say it's not good practice to run commands as root, right? Because you get admin privileges, and you can run malicious stuff. But then, I mean, what can you do in a container? Everything is sandboxed from your host machine, right? So that's why I believe the creators of Docker decided it's okay to run everything by default as root. But there are some software that still enforce this requirement. Maybe they're not aware of, it's running inside the Docker in the containers environment. So what can we do here? One thing is, the solution is very clear there. Rerun that whole command with allow root appended. Another way is that we can create a non-root user in our Dockerfile, and then have this be the default user that is that logs into the container when the container is created. I think we should go for the latter approach, because there are some software or libraries that won't work at all if you are in root, and they don't even provide workarounds for it. So I think it's good to figure out how to add non-root user in a Docker environment. Fortunately, this is something very common, and there's good documentation on the vscode help page that shows you how to do this exactly. So if you go back to Google and search for vscode remote non-root user, yep, the first one.
So I'm going to jump in and actually ask you a somewhat unrelated question to what we're doing, but I think it's an important question that maybe beginners such as myself are curious about. So far we've focused on just the documentation. Do you always jump to the documentation first, or would you jump to Stack Overflow first? Because my gut would always jump to Stack Overflow.
Ah,
But but so far you've always jumped to the documentation. Is that something that you recommend users get more comfortable reading the documentation?
Yeah, because for me, before I learn, before I start using, a piece of software, I always read the documentation first, and I read everything, but not necessarily in detail, right? I will definitely follow everything in the getting started, and then for the advanced stuff, I'll just skim through it. But at least I know what is that software capable of. And so later on, when I have for the first time I encountered this problem with this Jupyter,
Mhm.
I knew the solution is to create a non-root user, and also I remembered coming across it when I was reading the documentation, some time back. So that's why I knew, when you type these keywords, the first result is going to be what I want. And also I like to stick to the documentation because it tends to be more up to date as opposed, with the Stack Overflow question. It could be outdated, especially with a tool like VS Code. New features get added quite regularly, and so what used to work, or there may be better ways, to get to use a feature, but it's not captured in the Stack Overflow answer.
Okay. I think
So if
common for beginners to jump to Stack Overflow, if only because the answer can be self-contained. Instead of everything, you get one nice self-contained small answer and nothing else.
that's
So I think
true.
it creates a bad habit I know I have of always jumping.
Yeah, I also don't know a lot of people who actually read the documentation before they actually use the software.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we all believe you do that and not just say you do it. Yep, we believe you.
Okay, so if you look at the right pane, there should be something like adding a non-root user. Yeah, that one, adding a non-root user to your dev container. So click that. And then if you scroll down slowly, just scroll down. Are you scrolling? Okay.
I am. It's going a little slow on your via Zoom.
Okay, so you see that creating a non-root user,
Yep.
and then that code snippet there. Yeah. So this is all the command you need to create a non-root user. So what we will do is that we'll copy this snippet, the whole thing, and then paste it to our Dockerfile. We should paste it. Yeah. Nah, doesn't matter because the third line will install JupyterLab in the root as root, but then it will be accessible. But because of that, it will be accessible to every other user in the container. So that's fine.
Okay.
And then the line 24 will say, from here on out, execute any commands as the username, which is defined in line 5. So here, username can be whatever we want, but I would say let's call it VS Code, and then you will see why in a second. Just one word.
Okay, so we've defined username to be VS Code.
Mm-hmm.
And then should we come down here and change this or no, because we
Oh,
defined it?
yep. It's no. Yeah, don't do that because it reads the username environment variable or argument from line 5.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. Now, what will happen when we create this container is that first it will pull from the Anaconda, it will use the Anaconda 3 image version 2020.11, and then it will install JupyterLab, and then from line 5 to 17, it will create a user called vscode. This will be a regular user with the ability to use sudo. So could come in handy when we need to install additional software in the root folder. Maybe, we don't know in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And then line 24 says that from here on out, any commands you execute will be executed as that VS Code user. Okay, so this doesn't tell the Docker to log into the container as user VS Code. To do that, we need to modify our .devcontainer.json file. You
Okay.
might want to save the Docker file first. Okay, now go back to the dev container, JSON. Now, if you scroll all the way to the bottom, all the way down, it says remote user equals VS Code. Yeah.
And so we can uncomment it.
That's right. So that's why I said let's use the username as VS Code, because save some typing.
So by uncommenting it, we are telling it to that our remote user by default is VS Code.
That's right. And then you see that it got underlined with that red squiggly line. It's because you have a syntax error in a JSON file. And the reason is because the preceding line, meaning line 18, is not separated with a comma. So just add a comma after line 18, and you will resolve the syntax error. Yeah. Okay. So that's all it takes to create a non-root user in a Docker file, and then logging into that container later on as that non-root user using VS Code. If you were to use a command line, after you build the container, you will need to run Docker run, and then there will be another argument you need to specify to say that log in as this username. Okay, so let's rebuild this container now. Oh wait, another thing. Yeah, there's also another very useful config to change. Go back to the dev container.
Yep.
So do you see that line 13? Settings, terminal.integrated.shell.linux, line 14. And then it's null right now. So I can't remember what's the default going to be for containers from that Anaconda 3 environment, but I think it's going to be the SH environment, sorry, the SH terminal, which is not really fun to work with because it's lacking a lot of nifty features.
Mm-hmm.
Usually we work with bash. So I think, so we need to set the shell to be bash. And for that, we need to know where in the container is the bash terminal, that file located. I think it's bin bash /bin/bash. I'm not sure, but we can try it now. And if it throws an error, yeah, we can troubleshoot and figure out what's the right place later.
So can you see
Oh,
the comment on my screen that says the path of the shell that the terminal uses on Linux is default is /bash /bash
yeah. So put that in
instead of null.
instead of now, yeah. And also quote it because this is a JSON file. Yeah, so save this and then rebuild the container.
So to rebuild the container, I'm going to go to the command palette, and it was the most recently used, so I'll rebuild the container.
Yeah.
Looks like that worked well.
Yes, it did. But your terminal is not bash. I wonder why. Can you not open any notebooks in VS Code? Because it will trigger that pop-up just now. So
So allow all Jupyter notebooks.
no, just don't open it in VS Code
Okay.
because that notification is kind of annoying to me at least. Okay, now I want to figure out why isn't it starting bash as your terminal. So can you go to terminal?
Yep.
And then just type which bash. So it is the bin bash, and it's the same as the dev container, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Just double check that. Yeah, that is so strange. Shell Linux bin bash. Yeah. Can you go back to the terminal
Mm-hmm.
and then type bash? Yeah, so strange, but
So
never mind.
it was not making it my default, but it was still working right in the background.
Yeah, yeah, never mind. Moving on. So that's, one of the reasons I like bash is because by default, you know who is logged in from the prompt itself compared to just shell. You're not sure whether it's root or some other user. Okay, so now let's see what happens if you attempt to launch JupyterLab with the IP address 0000. Okay, so this time it works. And you can see there is this instruction on how to access the notebook. There's a link there. And one of the nice things of doing this inside VS Code is that that link is actually clickable. Not that one, the second one, the 127001. Yeah, if you just press command click, it will direct you to the page. And then, yeah, so this is JupyterLab. So yeah, so for next week, we'll continue with JupyterLab.